How's it, guys? And yeah, we're back with another episode of the PH Journals podcast. It's a doozy. It's a big one. There's been a couple of developments from the South African point of view, but most importantly from the United States point of view. So on the 23rd of January 2025, Cyril Ramaphosa signed the expropriation bill into effect. And what does this mean for the South African hunting industry? We discuss this topic in this week's episode of the podcast. So, guys, like mentioned, on the 23rd of January, Cyril Ramaphosa signed the land expropriation bill into effect. Now, what does this mean? Well, to put it into simple terms, the ANC government or the government can expropriate land without any sort of compensation. Now, what does this mean for the hunting industry? Now, while the PH Journals podcast is not one to really dive into the political side of things and worry about politics, this has a massive effect on our conservation efforts, but most importantly, our wildlife as well. But before we get into the nitty gritty, it's important for us to understand what the numbers are, right? So if you guys don't mind me, please excuse, I'm gonna refer to a lot of the stats that I've been able, and I've been very fortunate to deep dive into this topic and understand a little bit more about how the South African land has been distributed over the past couple of years. Now, for reference, if you guys would like to find out the history of land expropriation or the Land Act and Bantu stands and the Transkei and all that sort of stuff, please head along. I'll tag the description. Well, I'll tag the podcast down below. Pennell the Black Pen did an exceptional job on highlighting the history of the land based in South Africa. And then he did a second segment of a podcast where he highlighted, some of the pros and cons and the perception that one will have in modern day society. Now, a lot has changed since 1903 when the whole land expropriation bill was essentially designed back then, where a whole lot of different tribes and the Boer and the English army would make these sort of agreements over land, and they would dish out land, and it's a wonderful way of it. He highlights the history very, very well. So my perspective on this whole thing, and this episode is purely going to be my perception on how I've perceived things in the past couple of days, listening to different podcasts, and also a little bit of knowledge of where my family has been and come from to understand where we are going now. And being part of the hunting industry, what does that mean for our conservation efforts? Now, before we get into any sort of discussion, it's important to highlight the numbers. So the numbers are as follows. South Africa covers about approximately 122 million hectares of land. But this land is divided, of course, agriculture, livestock grazing, and all that sort of stuff. So about 78%, that's 96 million hectares of land, is used for agricultural. But only 12% of that land is suitable for crop production. The rest is all grazing. Now, 14% of the country's land, the government owns about 14% of South Africa's land. 79% is privately owned. Now, this is a very important number here because 14% is owned by the government. However, according to sources, previously that number was a lot larger, closer to the 20% mark. But because of the ANC government in the past 30 years has distributed the land amongst one another, it falls under the privately owned land. And then 7% is obviously unaccounted for. Now, to understand the numbers, the ANC government back out, I'm going to get these dates wrong, so please forgive me for that. I think it was around about 2008 or 2007 where they set out a mandate that 30% of the land in South Africa will be owned by black farmers. To date, 25% of the farmland is now owned by black South Africans. That number is very, very important when we're talking about land expropriation without compensation, because whether we like it or not, and whether we beat around the bush enough or not, unfortunately, there is a racial factor to this. A lot of black individuals are still carrying a burden from the apartheid regime. And no matter what view you have on it, whether you sticking up for the minority of South Africans or whether you're a black individual wanting land, no one can take back what the history has dealt us, right? No, we can't take back the past. We can only build towards the future. Now, why do I say this? Well, I say it because it's important. We need to understand that a little over 30 years ago, South Africa had a turning point. And that turning point meant that it was a country for free South Africans, no matter what color you were. And that's important to understand because for the past 30 years, we have evolved, we have changed, needs have changed, infrastructure's changed, interest rates have changed, our whole dynamic has shifted. Now, why do I say this? Well, it's important, and Pennell did an exceptional job in highlighting this fact that he gave an example of, do you want 2 hectares of land or would you like 30,000 Rand in a sustainable job? Now, of course, I thought an overwhelming majority would actually select the 30,000 Rand because there's a lot more you can do with 30,000 Rand. But a small, well, majority of the individuals that he had on the polls, I think it was on X, previously known as Twitter, a small, well, a majority, but just a majority, selected the 30,000. The rest all wanted the 2 hectares of land. Now, there's a whole argument that goes on how this can be beneficial to both parties and how you can leverage both sides of the thing. And from a lot of discussion was leverage through the 2 hectares. You could use the land to leverage and all that sort of stuff. However, and this is the important point, and this is why I mentioned why things have changed in the past 30 years. Unfortunately, if you are a family that will inquire a piece of land that has been a grazing or cattle farm or crop farm, whatever it may be, and you inquire that piece of land and you do get it, what are the implications the government has to hold to itself and to those individuals that take over that land? Now, what do I mean by this? I mean that, and it's broken down very, very well. You need to understand that to run a farm or any sort of agriculture, you need capital. Now, without capital, nothing can grow. You can't purchase livestock. You can't purchase supplements. The list goes on and on and on. So there will be some sort of economic expectation from the South African government. Never mind that they've just given you a piece of land. They will then have to give you capital to start. Then it becomes financial management. And then it becomes household essentials such as medical aid and all that sort of stuff. And then you need money to live. Now, this is very, very important because if you're going to take an individual that has been studying in Stellenbosch or in Cape Town, Johannesburg at UJ, he's been studying architecture or financial advising or accountant or sports science, whatever it may be, he's been given a piece of land. For that individual to change a mindset, to utilize that land, not only for the benefit of his family, but for the benefit of our country, for economical growth, there's going to be massive, massive interventions that we will have to understand as far as the taxpayer is concerned. So, with that little waffle on, we are still a very, very far away from that side of things. I believe there is a lot of gray area, there's a lot of red tape. And like we've seen with the statistics that I read a little bit earlier, 14% of the land is government owned. So that would be an exceptional starting point. But also, I wanted to highlight something that I've always been curious about, and that is the Transkei. Now, the Transkei falls part of the Xhosa kingdom and parts of the Zulu kingdom. More up north towards KwaZulu Natal is all Zulu land. The Transkei, as long as I've been going there, and as long I come from a very fortunate position where my father and grandfather they had trading stations in the Transkei. So the little bit of knowledge I have is all through stories that they used to share with me, and my father's involvement in the Transkei as a whole. My dad was very hands-on when it came to certain establishments. We have a house down on the Transkei coastline where he was extremely involved in the community. Um, so my basic knowledge of what the Transkei can give is is very limited. However, I feel it's a very important topic we need to ask because the Transkei is some of the most fertile land there possibly is for crops. And this would be a perfect place to start when distributing lands. Now, I understand that it's not as easy as just picking up a piece of land and saying everyone's entitled to 2 hectares or whatever it may be. There might be historical reasons behind why one would want to inquire that land or expropriate that piece of property. I am fully aware of that. And that's why I say, hence, we are very, very far away of this system being implicated correctly and beneficially for economic growth. Um, but I think this topic is extremely important to understand. Now, with all of this being said, what is the real reason behind it? So, before I get into it, this was the clip played, or this is the clip I downloaded of TikTok about Donald Trump on his thoughts of the land expropriation bill.
Mr. President, you said so on Truth Social. You said that you were going to cut aid from South Africa. Will you plan to cut aid across other African nations, and why South
No,
Africa?
it's only South Africa. Terrible things are happening in South Africa. The leadership is doing some terrible things, horrible things. So that's under investigation right now. We'll make a determination. And until such time as we find out what South Africa is doing, they're taking away land, they're confiscating land, and actually they're doing things that are perhaps far worse than that.
Now, sure, a lot can be taken completely out of context there. And I don't think the people that are advising Trump are guys that are being extremely worried about where this is all going, and rightfully so. I think if us as individuals, we look at this whole thing and there isn't a little bit of concern or worry within us, we would definitely have the wrong perception on how this all looks. So, like I said, what does this mean for the greater picture of the hunting industry? Well, Wayne Dill did an extremely good description, where he told a wonderful story about it in one of his podcast episodes. I think it was the Trail Camera episode, where a lot of the private farms bordered the Ciskei area. Now, the Ciskei is similar to what the Transkei situation was. These were Bantu stands back in the apartheid regime, where the Xhosa people were pushed out to these areas, and they had limited resources there, but they had to utilize what the land would be able to give them. So a lot of them grew up as subsistence farmers, and they utilized what they possibly could within their facility to provide for their family, whether it be a small amount of trade out of their crops or livestock that they had. But majority of these areas were held down by some sort of hierarchy, chiefdoms and kingdoms and all that sort of stuff. So what had happened is, and I had the very, very fortunate opportunity a couple of years ago, and I think it was just before COVID, I had the fortunate opportunity to actually hunt the Ciskei area. And I met a wise old gentleman there by the name of Mr. Yee. And he was incredibly well knowledged individual. He had been living off the Ciskei lands and the lands down at the bottom along the Fish River banks, where they did a lot of their subsistence farming. And we obviously sitting around the one afternoon while we were waiting to head out in for the evening hunt. We were just sitting around there and having a general conversation. And in conversation, I said to him, I said, Mr. Kitty, what is the animal species like here? How many? And he says, Dylan, we've got nothing left. You hardly ever see a kudu. You never see a bushbuck. You never see a blue darker. Everything has been so intensely hunted out, from porcupine to even the dassies on the rocks were completely taken out. And now this begs the question, right back to what we've all been saying for decades, is that if it doesn't pay, it will not stay. And this is an important factor. Now, why would they eradicate um, the wildlife? Why would they take it out? We need to understand that South Africa is a third world country and poverty is rife. No matter where you look, no matter where you go, no matter what city you go to, there's some sort of poverty. With an unemployment rate of over 40%, it's no wonder that people are going to tend to look for cheaper sources of protein, not only to get nutrients out of it, but also to bring the living costs down. Because if you can go and harvest the kudu with dogs and you have meat for the next 2 or 3 months, you've got access to protein, and you bring your household living expenses right down. And you can live off the basic essentials, from mini meal to bread and those sort of things. A basic staple diet. Now, like mentioned before, a lot of these areas in the Ciskei and the Transkei area were, hypothetically speaking, living off a lot more smaller dwellings. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, back in the day, let's call a village had 10 households. And as life would have it, those 10 households would have kids and would breed, and those kids will go away. And like I said, unemployment rate is 40% at the moment. The kids wouldn't find jobs elsewhere. They would come back home and they will build another little homestead. So these 10 homesteads will grow to 40 to 50 homesteads in a matter of a couple of years. Now, the size of the village is growing. Therefore, the more miles that have to be fed is growing. Now, if something is not paying its way, if the villagers aren't being compensated for those animals to be on that land in some way or possible, they are going to eradicate what is there, because no one is sitting around at the village every single evening or once a week sitting around the table saying, how many kudu did you take this week? How many bushbuck did you take this week? How many dassies did you hunt with the dogs? No one is working out a sustainable system to manage this livestock, because it's every household for themselves now, right? Households getting bigger, the expenses are getting bigger. So what is one way to bring it down? Let's get cheap protein in it and free, right? Let's go out and hunt kudu, because that kudu is going to feed us for the next 2 or 3 weeks. It will sustain our 3 households within our family, and we can look at it. And hence why Wayne and other individuals along the Fish River side are sitting with a poaching problem, because those animals have been eradicated, living expenses have increased, so people can't go out to the supermarkets and go and buy cheap protein. So what better way than to take a couple of dogs at night, head across the Fish River, and let's go and poach our source of protein? Why not? And that is the dilemma that we're sitting with right now. So what does this mean for land expropriation? Well, like I mentioned, if individuals aren't invested into maintaining strong herd management or wildlife management systems, and they want to utilize the land for completely different purposes, and that those animals don't pay their way there, they are going to be eradicated, whether we like it or not. Now, let's understand the hunting numbers. So in 2015, there were around about 9,000 international visitors to South Africa, which 80% of those were hunters. And they brought a staggering 2.8 billion rand into our economy. Now, the broader hunting industry, as we sit right now in 2025, or these are 2024 stats, they have brought in a staggering 14.4 billion rand and supplying more than 20 to 30,000 jobs across the country. That is exceptional. That is unbelievable. So what we need to understand in those numbers is that if we eradicate, and I'm not one to say that the individuals that expropriate that game farm, they are going to rock up there and not know what they're doing. I'm not one to say that. I'm just saying that what if those interests are different? And that number, let's even call it 10%, and 900 of those international hunters don't come in anymore because those game farms have been expropriated. How does the management system look then? And the interesting conversation we should be having is, how has Zimbabwe sustained a management system in their land? Was it because of their concessions that they had and not a lot of privately owned game farms? So the government didn't have anyone to be accountable for those lands? I'm not 100% sure. I've hunted Zimbabwe once or twice. And from what I've seen, a lot of the individuals, a lot of the outfitters involved in those sort of systems have done an exceptional job in getting around it. So while this is not all doom and gloom for South Africa, there are ways and means to get around it. And we need to learn from places like Rhodesia, Zimbabwe. But there's no doubt that it is going to cause some sort of disruption within our industry. Jobs are going to get lost, livelihoods are going to be lost, and it's going to send shockwaves not only across the South African hunting industry, but the world in a whole. Because whether you like it or not, South African is definitely top 5 hunting destinations, whether we like it or not. And it's up to us now to preserve this. So, guys, with that all being said, what is my opinion on the future of the hunting industry with land expropriation without compensation? Well, like I mentioned before, it's hard to figure things out right now. It is really, really hard to forecast what could possibly go down and how things are going to go down. However, we have come a long way as South Africans, black, white, Indian, colored, no matter what race you are, we have come an exceptionally long way. And for the most part of it, I think there's becoming more of a mutual understanding amongst one another. One of the biggest aspects I saw and my perception is that it wasn't just the land that was taken all those years ago. It was individuals' dignity. With being able to be proud about owning a piece of land, a part of land, and all that sort of stuff. However, life has changed since then. And I hate the fact that us as South Africans, we always use this one umbrella term. Blacks believe this, whites believe that. I feel it's a very sensitive topic, but we throw the generalizing blanket a lot. And it's not the case in majority of the situations. At the end of the day, I feel there's a lot of us South Africans that are out there that want the same things for one another. And again, this is not talking to any specific race group. we all want the same thing. We want to live prosperous lives in a beautiful country that's got beautiful sceneries, that we embrace our wonderful cultures and share diversity and understand that that's what makes us as a country. And that is what is so special about South Africa. And I do feel that there's a very small minority that is trying to wedge this massive divide amongst us, from politicians to highly influential people within our industry, within our cultures, within our governance, whatever it may be. And for the rest of us, we're all sitting back and feeling the brunt of the things and not quite knowing what the next step is. However, I feel if we just carry on putting one foot in front of the other and wanting the best possible outcome, not only for ourselves, but for our neighbors, it can only put us in good stead for the future. Now, to close it all off, I think land expropriation without compensation is a long way from being implemented completely. I think there's a lot of red tape. So if you are a hunter, if you are an international hunter that is wanting to come out to South Africa, please, guys, please come out. Come and experience our diversity of cultures, our beautiful landscapes. Come down and see everyone smiling and understand that our differences are being fought in Parliament and not on the ground. And that's the most important thing. Because no matter whether you a hunter, an outdoor enthusiast, a photographer, whatever the case may be, South Africa has some of the most exceptional landscapes there are out there and the most beautiful wildlife. And we are striving and we are fighting so hard to make sure that our wildlife comes out at the top. So, with that being said, I hope this was an informative podcast. You guys learned a lot, and hopefully, there is a little bit of understanding behind it. While the rest of the world loses its mind about tariff wars, um, you know, Rwanda, DRC, there's a whole lot of things that are going on outside of our control. What we do know is that we've still got an exceptional season ahead of us. So let's enjoy what we've got. So, guys, that's it from me. Thank you so much for tuning into this week's episode of the podcast. If you are, happy hunting. Until then, stay safe, stay blessed, and stay humble. We'll catch up with you guys soon.